He came home after a long day on patrol, but there was someone in his bed. An Apache woman, bruised, silent, and hiding from men who wanted her dead. What the sheriff did next changed both their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind came down from the mountains that evening with a dry, metallic whistle, sweeping dust and brittle leaves across the empty plains. It carried the scent of pine smoke and winter, and the faint echo of a world that no longer needed a man like Eli Maddox. He rode slow, his horse's hooves crunching over frost-hardened dirt, his breath hanging white in the air. The sky stretched wide and cold, a sheet of gray pressed low over the ridges. The sun had fallen an hour ago, leaving behind that ghostly light which comes before full darkness when the land looks carved from iron. Eli had long stopped counting the years since he'd left the badge behind. The town of Rock Ridge, once a speck of noise and promise, lay miles behind him, and so did the man he used to be. His cabin stood alone on the high ground, half hidden by cottonwoods stripped bare by the wind. He had built it himself after Sarah died. One room, rough-hewn walls, a stone hearth, a bed too big for one man. That night, as he came down the slope, he saw something that made his pulse tighten, a thin thread of smoke curling from the chimney. For a long moment he stayed in the saddle, staring. No one should have been there. He had not lit a fire that morning. The place was always cold when he returned, the air inside dead and still. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching, hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver. The horse flicked its ears, uneasy. Eli tied the reins to the post, listening. The only sound was the creak of the trees and the whistle of wind through the eaves. He approached the door and paused, scanning the ground. Faint tracks marked the frozen dirt. Barefoot, small, light. His jaw tightened. Whoever had come wasn't a man. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun and stepped inside. Warmth hit him first, faint but real. A fire burned in the hearth, flames licking over the dry wood he'd stacked a week ago. The room smelled of smoke, earth, and something else. Blood, maybe. Or fear. On his bed, beneath his wool blanket, lay a woman, her dark hair spilled across the pillow in a tangled mass, her face half turned toward the firelight. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were half open, watching him. They were deep and dark, reflecting the flame like glass. Her skin was the color of sun-baked clay, her dress torn, smeared with dirt. He saw bruises up her arms, the raw mark of rope still visible at her wrists. Eli froze where he stood. His finger tightened slightly on the trigger, then eased. He had seen Apache women before, back when he rode patrol along the border. But never like this. Alone, broken, half-starved. She couldn't have been older than 25. Every instinct told him to drag her outside, to keep trouble from crossing his threshold. Men in town didn't need much reason to hang a man who harbored an Indian woman. But another part of him, the quieter, older part that still remembered Sarah's voice, held him still. He could almost hear her. If you turn away from mercy, you'll never find peace again. The woman shifted weakly, her cracked lips moving. He stepped closer, lowering the gun but not holstering it. "Don't try anything," he said out of habit, though he knew she couldn't understand. She whispered something in a language he hadn't heard in years, words that sounded like water running over stones. Then her eyes closed, and her body went slack. Eli sighed, holstered the gun, and moved to the hearth. He knelt, added 2 logs to the fire, and let the warmth push back the chill. His breath steadied. He took the tin cup from the shelf, filled it with water from the barrel, and held it out. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, fingers thin, nails broken. She drank in small, painful sips, each swallow sounding like effort. When the cup fell empty, she let it slip from her grasp, too weak to hold it. He studied her face in the flickering light. Dirt streaked her cheek, but beneath it her features were fine, almost delicate. There was a bruise on her jaw, another at her temple. Someone had beaten her recently. The sight stirred something heavy inside him. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of old sadness that had never gone away. He remembered Sarah's face the night she died, the way she'd reached for him as the bullet tore through the air. He had failed to protect her. That failure had followed him every day since. And now, here was another woman lying broken in his bed, another life balanced on the edge of his choice. Eli stood, paced once across the room, then stopped. He looked at the badge hanging on the wall, a dull brass star on a nail beside his coat. It caught a faint glint of the fire. Once, that badge had meant something. Justice, duty, truth. Now it was nothing but metal and memory. He thought about putting it away for good, burying it under the floorboards, but instead, he left it where it was. Some symbols refused to die, even when the man who wore them tried to. He crossed to the table, tore off a piece of bread from the loaf he'd brought from town 2 days ago, and set it near her on the blanket. She didn't move. He sat down on the stool, elbows on his knees, and watched the flames dance. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the shutters. The sound reminded him of the long nights after Sarah's funeral, when he'd sat here in the dark with nothing but the crackle of fire to fill the emptiness. Tonight felt the same, and yet not. There was another heartbeat in the room, faint but steady. Hours passed. The fire burned low, the wood crackling into embers. The woman's breathing evened out, no longer shallow gasps, but slow, tired sighs. Eli dozed in the chair, gun on his lap, never letting himself fall fully asleep. Sometime before dawn, he heard her whisper again, just a few sounds, words he couldn't place. They might have been names, or prayers. He didn't know which. When light finally began to seep through the window, pale and weak, he stirred. The fire had almost died, leaving only a faint orange glow. He rose stiffly, fed the hearth with a few sticks of kindling, and poured water into the kettle. The woman shifted beneath the blanket, eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked lost, like someone who'd woken in another world. When she saw him, she tensed, drawing the blanket up to her chin. He raised a hand slightly, a peace gesture. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though the words meant nothing to her. She stared at him, wide-eyed, but didn't move. He filled a tin cup and slid it across the table toward her. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were bruised, but her grip was stronger than the night before. She drank slowly, never taking her eyes off him. Eli noticed the rope's marks again, deep, raw, almost burned into her skin. He wondered what kind of men had done that. The plains had become home to bounty hunters and slavers after the war men who made their living from the suffering of others. Maybe she had escaped from one of them. Maybe they were still hunting her. The thought made his stomach tighten. When she finished drinking, she set the cup down and drew the blanket closer. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to him, as if weighing whether he would let her go or lock her in. He didn't move. Instead, he said one word, slow, deliberate. "Stay." He didn't know if she understood, but she didn't rise. He spent the morning splitting wood, his axe striking a steady rhythm outside the cabin. The air bit at his skin, sharp and dry. Every sound carried far in the cold, the creak of the handle, the thud of each log hitting the pile. It helped him think or not think. When he went back inside, she was still there, sitting up now, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The bread he'd left was gone. She had eaten, which meant she intended to live. That, at least, was something. Eli knelt by the hearth again and added more wood. The fire caught quickly. The smell of smoke filled the room, mixing with the faint scent of her hair. Earth, pine, and something wild he couldn't name. She watched him closely, but the fear in her eyes had softened into wary awareness. He took a strip of dried venison from his pack, cut it into small pieces, and placed them on a plate. She hesitated only a moment before reaching out. Her fingers brushed his hand by accident, and he felt the tremor in them. Part hunger, part exhaustion. As she ate, he sat back, studying her. Her clothes were torn beyond repair, the seams split at the shoulders, the neckline ragged. She had tried to tie the fabric with a strip of leather, but the gesture only made her look more fragile. Her hair, long and black, fell over her face when she bent forward. For the first time in years, Eli found himself unsure where to look. He turned his eyes toward the fire instead, tracing the flicker of light across the stones. She finished eating and pushed the plate back toward him. She didn't speak, but she bowed her head slightly, and he understood it for what it was, a thank you, wordless but clear. He nodded once, the closest thing to acceptance he could give. The day passed in silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. Eli worked around the cabin, mending the broken latch on the door, fetching water from the creek, tending to the horse. Each time he stepped back inside, she was there, sitting near the fire, wrapped in his blanket. Her eyes followed him, cautious but no longer frightened. He found himself talking aloud once, half under his breath, as if explaining his chores to someone who might care. She watched, listening, though she likely understood nothing. Still, it felt less like talking to himself. By dusk, the temperature dropped sharply. The sky darkened to violet, and frost crept along the window edges. Eli closed the shutters, checked the rifle, and set it beside the door. He cooked a small pot of beans, the smell filling the cabin. When he handed her a tin bowl, she took it without hesitation. The warmth of the fire flickered between them, lighting her face in gold and shadow. Later, as night settled heavy over the land, she lay back on the bed, wrapped in the blanket. He sat in the chair, arms crossed, listening to the wind outside. The crackle of the fire and the slow rhythm of her breathing became the only sounds in the room. Something inside him, long dormant, stirred a faint awareness that the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. When sleep finally came to him, it came light and uneasy. The memory of Sarah's laughter drifted through his dreams, blending with the whisper of the woman's voice. He woke once in the night to find the fire low, her eyes half open, watching him. Neither spoke. He rose, fed the flames, and sat again until dawn. By morning, the frost had thickened across the window glass. The world outside was white, but inside, warmth clung to the air. Eli poured coffee into a tin cup and stood by the fire, staring at the slow rise of smoke through the chimney. He knew the moment wouldn't last. Whatever had brought her here would come looking soon enough. But for now, in that small cabin at the edge of the world, there was light again, and for the first time in 6 years, he didn't mind coming home. The days that followed were slow, pale stretches of time that blurred together with the hiss of wind and the soft rhythm of fire crackling in the hearth. The woman stayed. Eli had not told her to, and she had not asked. She simply remained, sleeping on his bed while he took the stool beside the fire. Her wounds began to close. The gray pallor of her skin gave way to a warmer hue. She still spoke little, and when she did, her words were fragments, half English, half Apache, shaped by breath and gesture more than sound. He called her Naya, after the only word she repeated when pointing to herself. Whether it was her name or something else, he couldn't tell. but she did not correct him. Eli's cabin, long a place of silence, began to sound different. The scrape of her footsteps on the floorboards, the faint hum she made while tending the fire, the splash of water when she washed her hands. All of it broke the stillness that had hung over his life since Sarah's death. He found himself listening for those sounds, marking the hours by them. In the mornings, he would split wood behind the house, each swing of the axe echoing through the cold air. Through the open window, he sometimes caught glimpses of Naya moving near the hearth, her figure small but deliberate, arranging his few possessions into some quiet order of her own. He told himself it was temporary. She would rest, regain her strength, and leave before trouble found them. But by the fourth day, he no longer believed that. There was something about the way she moved through the space, like she was claiming it not through force, but through presence. A stray piece of thread from her torn dress hung from the table leg. A cup left near the bed carried the faint print of her fingers. Each small trace made the cabin feel less like a grave and more like a home. Still, Eli's instincts were never quiet. The life of a lawman had taught him that calm often came before danger. Each night he checked the rifle, reloaded the Colt, and made sure the latch on the door held. Naya watched him do it without fear or question, as if she understood exactly why. Sometimes their eyes met, and though no words passed between them, something like recognition flickered in that silence, an understanding that both had lived too long with danger to pretend it wasn't near. On the fifth morning, Eli saddled his horse. The flour was nearly gone, and the kerosene low. He would have to ride into Rockridge. He disliked the thought of leaving her alone, but the trip couldn't be avoided. He set an extra log on the fire, then pointed to it so she'd understand. "Keep it burning," he said. She nodded once, her dark hair falling across her cheek. Her face looked stronger now, her eyes less sunken. But there was still a shadow there. Fear, or maybe memory. The trail to town was stiff with frost, the ground hard as stone. Eli rode in silence, his breath clouding in the air. The world beyond his land looked smaller every time he ventured back into it, as if the people had grown meaner, the buildings narrower, the air heavier with suspicion. When he reached Rockridge, the streets were busy despite the cold. Wagons creaked past the general store, men shouted from the stables, and the bell over the saloon door clanged endlessly. He tied his horse near the trough, keeping his hat low. Inside the store, he gathered flour, salt, coffee, and a small tin of kerosene. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a drooping mustache, eyed him over the counter. "Didn't expect to see you down from the hills," he said. Eli grunted something that might have been agreement. The man shrugged. "Winter's coming hard this year. Folks say it'll freeze the river solid." Eli nodded, paid, and turned to go. But before he reached the door, he heard the sound of laughter outside. Low, coarse, too familiar. He recognized the voices even before he saw the faces. Two men from the saloon, drifters who'd worked for the army years ago when Eli still wore the badge. They were talking loudly, their words thick with whiskey. "She can't have gone far," one said. "Half dead when she bolted. Captain's still offering $50 to whoever finds her." The other spat into the snow. "50? For a squaw? Hell, I'd take 10. The men laughed, and Eli's hand closed around the strap of his sack. "They say she was seen up near the ridge," the first man went on. "Maybe hiding in the hills." Eli stepped out into the street. The men turned and saw him. For a moment, the noise around them dimmed. One of them squinted. "Maddox, didn't know you still came down among folks." "Just getting supplies," Eli said evenly. "Still living alone up there?" the man asked, smirking. "Heard you talking to ghosts." Eli's gaze stayed flat. "Ghosts are quieter than you two." He walked past them. They chuckled, but the laughter faded as he mounted his horse. He could feel their eyes on his back, until he reached the edge of town. Only when the roofs of Rockridge disappeared behind him did he let the anger fade from his jaw. He rode faster on the way home. The thought of those men talking about the woman, about her, settled in his gut like a stone. By the time he reached the clearing, the sky had turned slate gray. Smoke rose steady from his chimney. Relief came before suspicion. Then he saw that the latch on the gate had been repaired, the same one he had meant to fix that morning. Inside, the cabin was warm. Naya sat near the fire, mending his old coat with a crooked needle and a piece of thread she must have found somewhere. She looked up when he entered, her eyes widening briefly before softening. He dropped the sack on the table and removed his gloves. The coat she worked on lay across her knees, the needle moving slow but careful. The stitching was uneven, but it held. For a moment he just watched her, the rhythm of her work strangely calming. When she noticed his gaze, she paused, uncertain, as if waiting for him to scold her for touching something that wasn't hers. Instead, he said quietly, "That's good work." She tilted her head, not understanding the words, but his tone was enough. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She lowered her eyes again and continued. Eli stepped closer to the hearth, warming his hands. "Town's stirring," he said, more to himself than to her. Men talking. Looking. She didn't know the language, but she sensed the change in his voice. Her movements slowed, and her gaze lifted to his face. He pointed toward the door, then to her, then mimed the motion of men riding. "Danger," he said, making the words sharp. She frowned, but understanding dawned in her eyes. She nodded, once, firmly. He felt something shift between them then, a quiet pact sealed not by speech, but by trust. She believed him, even without the words to explain why. That night, after the meal, he sat at the table and stared at the badge hanging on the wall. The brass had dulled over the years, its edges catching only a faint glint of firelight. He reached for it slowly, the metal cold in his hand. He remembered the weight of it on his chest, the sound it made when it brushed against his vest. Sarah used to polish it for him, rubbing it with a cloth until it shone. "If you're going to carry it," she used to say, "let it mean something." He pinned it to his shirt again. The action felt heavy, deliberate. The star caught the firelight and held it, small but steady. Naya watched from the bed, her eyes following the movement with quiet curiosity. He didn't speak, didn't explain. But inside, a line had been crossed. The man who had walked away from duty had stepped toward it again, though in his own way. The badge no longer belonged to the county or the law. It belonged to his conscience. When he looked up, she was still watching. He nodded slightly, as if to assure her of something he couldn't name. She seemed to understand, because she lowered her gaze and smiled faintly before turning back to the fire. The following morning dawned gray and brittle. The cold had deepened overnight, the ground sparkling with frost. Eli rose early, as always. He brewed coffee, poured a small cup for her, and handed it across the table. She accepted it with both hands, blowing gently on the steam before taking a sip. Her fingers still bore the faint rope scars, but the skin had begun to heal. He found himself watching those hands longer than he meant to, the way they moved with care, the way they no longer trembled. When she caught him looking, she seemed almost amused. It was the first expression that wasn't fear or weariness. He looked away quickly, but a faint warmth stayed in his chest. As the day passed, he worked outside, mending the fence around the small corral, hammering rails back into place. From time to time, he glanced toward the cabin, where smoke rose from the chimney in a thin white ribbon. Once, he saw her step outside, wrapped in his old blanket, looking up at the pale sky. Her hair, loose and dark, caught the light. She turned when she noticed him watching, then went back inside. The sight left him strangely unsteady. That evening, as the light faded, he found her kneeling by the hearth, sewing again. This time she was stitching her own torn dress, using bits of thread she'd pulled from an old feed sack. Her fingers worked slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed the patience in her movements, the same patience she showed in everything. When she pricked her finger, she hissed softly, and he moved before he thought, taking her hand to see the small bead of blood. She stiffened at his touch, but didn't pull away. For a moment, they were very still, the fire's glow flickering between them. Then he released her hand and stepped back. She finished her sewing without another sound. By the time the moon rose, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm again. They ate beans and bread by the fire, the only light coming from the flames. Afterward, Naya gathered the dishes, rinsed them in cold water, and set them neatly on the table to dry. It was such a simple act, yet Eli felt it deeply. For years, the cabin had been filled with nothing but the traces of a life gone. Sarah's empty chair, her shawl folded in a trunk. Now there was movement again, a pulse of life returning where none had been. When she finished, she turned to him, hesitating. Then she pointed to the badge on his chest. Her eyes searched his face as if asking what it meant. He looked down at it and then back at her. "It's who I was," he said softly. "Maybe who I still am." She didn't understand the words, but she nodded, her gaze calm. Later that night, after she had lain down on the bed, Eli sat awake by the fire. The badge gleamed faintly in the flickering light. He thought about the men in town, about the way they'd laughed, about the $50 they'd said she was worth. He thought about the old oath he'd taken, to protect the innocent, to stand for what was right. Somewhere along the line, that promise had broken, but tonight he felt it stirring again. He knew that by keeping her here, he had crossed another kind of line, one that could not be uncrossed. If those men came looking, he would have to face them. The thought didn't frighten him. It felt inevitable, like the slow thaw after winter. He had lived too long in silence. Maybe this was the price for hearing another heartbeat under his roof. When the fire finally sank to embers, he lay back in the chair, the rifle propped against the wall beside him. The sound of her breathing filled the small space, steady, soft, human. It was enough to remind him that he was still part of the living world. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he dreamed not of graves or ghosts, but of light firelight, warm and steady, filling the house that had once known only cold. The morning after Eli pinned the badge back onto his chest, the world seemed to hold its breath. The snow had deepened overnight, blanketing the clearing in silence so thick it felt sacred. When he stepped outside, the cold bit at his face, sharp enough to make him blink. His boots sank into the snow with a soft crunch, and each step left a dark impression that filled almost as soon as he moved on. Smoke drifted from the chimney behind him, rising into the pale air like a signal no one was meant to see. Yet Eli couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere eyes were already watching that smoke. He stood for a long while, his gloved hand resting on the fence post, listening to the land. The wind was soft, the kind of deceptive quiet that came before storms or gunfire. He had learned long ago that peace on the frontier was never built to last. When he came back into the cabin, Naya was awake, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. She was kneeling by the hearth, feeding the fire with careful patience. The heat from it made her skin glow faintly, the color returning to her cheeks. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she had entered his home, her eyes didn't flinch from his. There was no fear there, only a still watchfulness. Eli nodded in greeting, poured coffee into 2 tin cups, and handed one to her. She took it with both hands, murmuring a soft word he didn't understand. It sounded like thanks, He sipped his own and watched her over the rim of the cup. The marks on her wrists were fading now, but her movements still carried the memory of pain, small, cautious, as though she expected the world to hurt her at any moment. For a time they sat in quiet companionship, the fire popping and the wind pressing faintly against the walls. The cabin, once just a shelter against the cold, had begun to feel like something else. He didn't know when the shift had happened, but it was there, undeniable. The air was different. Her presence had changed the rhythm of his days, and even the silence seemed to breathe differently around her. He tried to remind himself that it couldn't last. The men who had hurt her were out there somewhere, and men like that didn't let go easily. By afternoon, the sky had darkened again. Heavy clouds crawled over the mountains, dragging a curtain of gray behind them. Eli worked outside, checking the traps and repairing the woodpile, while Naya swept the floor inside with a bundle of dry twigs she had tied together. Through the window, he saw her humming softly, the sound faint as a whisper. He realized he hadn't heard anyone hum in this house since Sarah died. The sound pierced something deep inside him, but he didn't stop to think about it. He was stacking wood against the wall when he heard it, the distant rhythm of hooves. At first it blended with the wind, but soon it grew clearer, closer. 2 horses, maybe 3, moving slow but steady along the ridge road. His breath caught. He set the log down carefully, his hand already drifting to the rifle leaning against the wall by the door. The sound faded after a moment, swallowed by the snow, but it left a pulse of dread in his chest. He turned back toward the cabin. Through the frosted glass, he saw Naya glance up, sensing his unease. He didn't say anything, only lifted his hand in a small motion that told her to stay quiet. That evening, the air inside felt heavy. The storm rolled in fast, snow beating against the walls, wind howling through the gaps in the roof beams. Eli checked the shutters twice, then placed the rifle near the door and sat at the table. Naya was by the fire, both blankets wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair falling loose down her back. The firelight flickered across her face, painting it in gold and shadow. She looked at him, then down at her hands. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm outside sounded like the growl of the earth itself. She was the first to break the silence. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Men," she said, the word heavy on her tongue. Eli looked up sharply. She touched her wrists, tracing the faint scars with her fingertips. "They take me. Chain. Hurt." Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "I run. If they find, kill you." He set his cup down. The words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. He could have told her not to worry, that no one would come, that the snow would keep them safe, but lies had no place in this cabin. Instead, he met her gaze and said quietly, "They'll have to find me first." She shook her head, tears welling but not falling. "You no must die. They bad men. Many." He rose slowly and crossed the small space between them. She flinched at first, but when she saw his hands empty, she stayed still. He crouched so that his eyes were level with hers. "I won't let them take you," he said. She couldn't understand every word, but something in his tone reached her. Her trembling stopped. She lifted a hand, hesitant, and touched his chest lightly over the badge. The metal was warm from his body. "Law?" she asked softly. Eli looked down at her hand, and then back at her. "Not their kind," he said. "Just mine." She nodded as if she understood, then lowered her hand. The night stretched long. Eli stayed near the door, rifle across his lap, listening for every sound beyond the wind. Naya sat near the fire, eyes on the flames, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Time passed slowly. The wood in the hearth cracked, and the shadows on the walls danced like restless ghosts. Each time the wind shifted, Eli thought he heard something beneath it. A creak, a faint crunch of snow. He waited, tense, until the noise blended back into the storm. It was near midnight when the sound came again, unmistakable this time. Hooves, closer now, breaking through the snow. He stood, the rifle rising in his hands. Naya froze where she was, eyes wide. The sound stopped just beyond the clearing. He crossed to the window, peeled back the shutter a fraction, and looked out. Through the whirling snow, he saw two dark shapes, men on horseback, lantern light swinging between them. His gut tightened. He turned back to Naya. "Hide," he said sharply, pointing toward the corner behind the bed. She didn't move at first, then obeyed, slipping into the shadows, her blanket clutched to her chest. The knock came moments later, loud enough to rattle the door on its hinges. "Bronick!" a voice shouted through the storm. The name was close enough to his that he knew they meant him. "We heard you been keeping what ain't yours. Best you hand her over now. Save yourself the trouble." Eli said nothing. He moved to stand directly before the door, the rifle steady in his hands. Another voice, rougher, followed. "You don't want to fight, old man? We'll take her and go. No one's got to know." Eli's pulse beat slow and heavy in his temples. "Ain't nothing here for you," he called back, his voice calm but cold. There was laughter outside. "We'll see about that." The latch rattled once, twice. Then the door shuddered under a hard kick. The bar held. A second kick splintered part of the frame. Eli stepped back just enough to brace himself. Behind him, he heard Naya's quick, shallow breaths. The next blow cracked the door open. The first man forced his way inside, snow swirling around him, lanterns swinging from his hand. He was big, with a beard stiff from frost, a revolver already drawn. Behind him came another, leaner, eyes glittering meanly in the firelight. Eli fired before either could speak. The sound exploded in the small room. The first man staggered back, the lantern slipping from his grip and shattering on the floor. Flames licked up instantly, hissing as they spread. The second man cursed and fired in return, the bullet thudding into the wall inches from Eli's head. Eli swung the rifle, fired again, and the man went down hard, his gun clattering across the boards. The cabin filled with smoke. Naya cried out softly but stayed where she was. Eli stamped out the flames with his boot, choking on the ash. The snow from outside blew in through the broken door, stifling what fire remained. The two bodies lay half in, half out of the threshold, red against the white snow. He stared at them for a long moment, his breath heavy, the rifle still clutched tight. When the silence finally settled, Naya emerged from the shadows. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She crossed the room slowly, her bare feet silent on the boards. Eli looked at her and shook his head. "It's over," he said, though they both knew it wasn't. He knelt beside the nearest body, checking for breath. There was none. Outside, the storm still raged, hiding everything in its fury. He dragged the bodies out into the snow, one at a time, his muscles screaming from exhaustion. The wind whipped against him, tearing at his coat. By the time he was done, his hands were numb, and his breath came in ragged bursts. He covered the men with branches and snow, knowing the storm would finish what he started. When he turned back, Naya was standing at the doorway, the blanket around her shoulders, her face lit faintly by the fire behind her. Inside again, he set the rifle down, leaned it against the wall, and sat heavily in the chair. His shoulder throbbed from the recoil, his ears still ringing. She approached slowly, knelt beside him, and took his hand in both of hers. For a moment he wanted to pull away, but her grip was firm, her fingers warm despite the cold. She pressed his hand to her chest, over her heart, and whispered one word. "Safe." Eli's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak. The word lingered in the air like a vow. They stayed awake the rest of the night. Naya tended the fire while Eli sat near the door, listening for any sound that might mean more men coming. But none did. The wind softened before dawn, and the first light crept through the cracks in the shutters. The snow outside glowed faintly blue. When he finally stepped outside, the land was still. The bodies were gone beneath the white. The world had buried them in silence. He came back in, shut the door, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to sit without armor. Naya poured him a cup of coffee, her movements gentle. She smiled faintly as she handed it to him, a small, quiet gesture that felt larger than anything he had known in years. Later, as the sun rose high and clear, they stood together at the edge of the clearing. The snow shimmered like glass under the light. Naya looked toward the horizon, her face calm. The lines of fear eased from it. Eli glanced at her and said softly, "You don't have to go." She turned to him slowly, searching his face. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she reached out and placed her hand in his. It wasn't a plea. It was a decision. They went back inside, the warmth of the fire filling the small cabin. Eli took another chair from the shed, the one he hadn't touched since Sarah died, and set it beside his at the table. The gesture was quiet, but final. The ghosts that had haunted the house had no place there anymore. Days passed. The bruises on her arms faded completely. She began to learn his words, simple ones at first. Water, bread, sleep, fire, and he learned fragments of hers. They worked side by side, hauling water, mending fences, rebuilding the door he had shattered. With each passing day, the rhythm between them grew steadier, the unspoken understanding deeper. By spring, the snow melted from the roof, and the earth began to soften beneath their feet. The air smelled of pine sap and wet soil. The world outside was still dangerous, still hard, but inside that small cabin, life had returned. Eli hung the badge on a nail above the door. It caught the morning light and gleamed faintly, like something reborn. "The law lives here now," he murmured once. Naya, not needing to understand the words, smiled. The wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of thaw and new beginnings. For the first time in 6 long years, Eli Maddox felt the ache of loss ease into something gentler. Something like peace. The house that had been a tomb for his grief now breathed again, alive with warmth, with laughter, with the fragile, quiet rhythm of 2 souls who had chosen not to be alone. And as he stood beside her on the porch, watching the first flowers push through the melting snow, he understood that the law he had once served was never in the badge. It was in the simple act of protecting what was right, and in the choice to keep the fire burning for another life beside his own. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are so many more stories to discover. And share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.